My name is David Steele. I'm the Senior Data Architect at Crunchy Data. And today's topic is reviewing Postgres patches for fun and profit. A little tongue-in-cheek there. The idea for this talk actually came from PGConf. Sorry. So the developers get together at PGConf and we talk about various topics and stuff. And one of the topics that came up was, a little bit of sort of outreach to people in the community who might be interested in starting to get involved with patches or reviewing patches, and trying to ease the way for them a little bit and kind of give them a bit of a primer on how that might be done. So it was actually Greg Stark who came up with the original idea, and then I talked to him and asked him if I could develop that into a talk, and so here we are. Certainly there have been talks on this given over the years. This is not the first one. By any stretch of imagination, if you go out and Google, you'll find some other talks. I think this is a little more comprehensive than some. But what I discovered when I did a test of this talk internally in our company about a month ago is that it's a big topic. So I'm going to try to get through all the slides that I have, but if I don't, the slides will be online, and you can go ahead and read through some of the rest of them on your own. But I'm going to go through sequentially from the very beginning, and then we'll get more and more in-depth as we go, and hopefully we'll get to the end. So really, when I started thinking about this, my main thought was, how do we economize on committers' time? One of the reasons why it's so important to have a large pool of reviewers is that the committers themselves are a scarce resource. There are really only a dozen, 15, less than 20 of them. So they're all extremely busy people. They have jobs too. Even though most of their jobs involve Postgres, they cannot, obviously there's only so many hours in the day, even if they work 24 hours a day. So the question is, as reviewers, how can we save them time? How can we do a lot of the legwork to try to reduce the amount of time a committer has to spend looking at a patch? Which is still, no matter how much review you do, is going to be significant. But if we can save them any time at all, it's huge, because there's a lot of us and there's only a few of them. So with that in mind, okay, so let's think about what patch review means. So how many, I assume most of the people in here are developers. So raise your hands if you're a developer. How about C coders? People who code in C, okay. All right, this is actually a good audience because the whole idea of this is that you don't need to be a C coder to help out here. So it's perfect. We've got some people who can go all the way down and some people who I'll show you where you can contribute. So the first thing about, this is the list of things, not necessarily in order, but the list of things we're trying to answer. The first one, this kind of seems like the most obvious, but does the patch work as specified? Does it do what it actually says it's supposed to do? And you'd be surprised how often that turns out not to quite be true. And it's not just that, maybe bad coding, it's just, you've tried it in a different environment, and somehow it ends up working differently under this system than that system, or you tried a new and novel thing that the author never thought of, or et cetera, et cetera. So there are lots of, so this is one big way you can help, is just figuring out, does the patch work, right? In order to be able to do that, all you really need to do is compile Postgres and apply a patch. You don't really need to be a coder to do that. Another thing to determine is it useful and needed? A lot of times there are ways to do things. Like almost anything you want to do, there's a way to do it. But it may not be convenient, it may not be performant, it may be a repetitive task that makes sense to actually build into Postgres. But this is a really big assessment. Not all patches get accepted, and one of the reasons why patches don't get accepted is because they don't actually fulfill a pressing need, or they don't differentiate themselves from an existing feature well enough to be accepted. Which is basically, in this point, does the functionality already exist, right? It may already be there, and the person who wrote the patch just didn't quite understand they could do it that way, or there could be just a bit of an argument about whether is the old way good enough, or do we need to add this enhanced way of doing something. Another thing is to make sure that documentation and tests are included. The feature has to be tested, and especially if it's a user-facing feature, it needs to be documented in the SGML documentation, which we'll talk about later. And if it's purely an internal feature, then it's going to need to have good documentation in the code. And it may also need, if it's a complicated feature, it may need readmes and other things to try to make it clearer to people coming later what that piece of code does, how it works, what the design philosophy behind it was. Does it follow applicable SQL or community standards? So let's say the patch is an extension to Postgres, the SQL language. If it is actually an ISO SQL capability, is the syntax implemented correctly? Does it fit Postgres community standards for coding, for documentation, for these sorts of things? And lastly, is performance acceptable? Performance is not applicable to every type of feature, but obviously in a database system, performance is something we're going to be thinking about all the time, right? This is constantly in the back of our minds. Does this thing perform acceptably? All right, so we're basically just going to, I got one more slide first. So the question is, so given that those are the goals, well, the overarching goal is to save committer time. The purpose of patch review is those things. So the question is, how can we help? So the first thing to say is that I think people can be quite intimidated when they look at patches because especially there's a little, in the CommitFest app, which we'll talk about, there's a little review section where it kind of says, have you gone through all these steps? And that's essentially a full review. And it can be a bit daunting. So I think the first thing I want to say is that it's perfectly okay to just review parts of the patch. And we're going to go through review steps kind of in the order of what I think of kind of order of complexity and to some extent order of usefulness to show these are the things you can do. So you might do steps 1, 2, and 3 and leave steps 4 and 5 to other people, right? So it's perfectly okay to say just work with the documentation or just compile it or just do functional testing. There's nothing wrong with that. It's a community project. People have different strengths and weaknesses, so it's fine that reviewers are not reviewing every part of the patch. And the other thing to say is that no contribution is too small, right? Especially to get started. I mean, you do not have to feel like you have this 3-month process you have to go through to help out. You can help out just by copy editing the documentation, right? That's a small and simple way to help out. And always appreciated. So what we're going to do first is we're going to go through, kind of figure out how to select a patch, right? This is actually really the first step in the process. So, patches are not going to be assigned to you. You're going to select a patch based on probably your interest. You can look through this list and find patches that interest you or a feature that you'd really like to have. Maybe you see something and go, oh man, I really wish that was always in Postgres. Now you can actually help get it into Postgres, so at least it'll be in the next release. So in order to keep track of all these patches and make sure things don't fall under the rug, behind the curtain, I don't know, there's an analogy there someplace. Anyway, we have this app called the CommitFest app. And it's at commitfest.postgres.org. It's completely public. You don't have to, just to go look at it, you don't have to have an account or anything. So when you go there, you'll see that there's basically a list of CommitFests here, past and present and future. And you'll see the present one. This is actually the current present one, which is 2.16.09. It started on September 1st, and it will end on September 30th. Although not everything, they don't usually end exactly on time. They end when we've actually dealt with all the patches in one way or another. But so if you're interested in looking for a current patch to go and review, then you want to pick the CommitFest that says it's open, right? That's the important thing. If it's closed, then, again, it needs to be open or it needs to be running. What do we call it? In progress, right? So the 901 CommitFest, I did this slide last month. Actually, the 901 CommitFest is now in progress. So you can go in there and find a patch to review. You can review patches that are in a CommitFest that's not in progress yet, that's still open. That's okay. You could have gone in August. I mean, people were already reviewing and committing patches for this CommitFest in August. So that's perfectly legitimate. But make sure you look for one that's open or in progress.
Right now, there's one in progress.
It says in progress, okay.
There's also one that's open.
That's open, right.
Open means you can still submit patches.
You can submit patches. And you could also be reviewing patches in that future CommitFest, the one that's open but not in progress, but it's better if you can stick to the in progress CommitFest, because that's what we're working on right now. But if the patch you see that you're interested in is in the next CommitFest, there's nothing wrong with jumping to that and actually starting to work on reviewing that. And like I said, this is all about choice. We're trying not to put too many rules on this so people can actually get some stuff done. When you do click, so you find the commit fest you want to go look at, the in progress or open one, you'll get a list of patches. Each one will have a brief description, it'll give a status. All the ones here you can say see needs review, so that's your opportunity, right? Those are the ones that you'd want to be looking at. They've got an author, they've got a list of reviewers, the person who's signed on to commit it, and then a couple of dates for activity. And if you further click into one of those items, you're going to get a lot more information. This might be a little hard to read. But you've got a lot of the information that was on the previous page. In addition, you now have information about the email thread where the patch was originally proposed. You've got the application actually automatically picks out the last patch that was submitted. So you've kind of got a shortcut. This is occasionally misleading because sometimes someone will post a counter patch, which is not the original author's patch, and the CommitFest application will pick that up. So if you really are going to test a patch, you'll need to look at the thread, which will, oh no, I've got one. Thanks, Joe. It's the angle here is just not very good. So yeah, here's the patch right here, I think. So you have to be a little careful. And then down here you have some history that shows when things were set to review or needs review or needs the author to look at it. You can see that I signed up as a reviewer on this patch in August because it's one that I'm interested in getting fixed. So I'm looking at that one. So like I said here, this is the actual thread that the patch was proposed on. So you can further click into it and you'll find the thread. Now this thread only has one message. I picked one that was really simple because there's just definitely a lack of real estate here. But generally threads will be longer. There'll be the original proposal and then there'll be various commentary on it. The reason why this one is so short is this patch has already been proposed before and had a fairly long thread and now has been fixed and updated on the basis of those remarks and then reposted. So, and you can find all this on the web. So you don't actually have to be, if you're going to do patch review, you are going to need to get on PGSQL Hackers to post your own messages. But in order to look at anything historical, you could just go find it on the web. Oh. All right, so. Oh.
So the CommitFest app is just it's a read-only vision of what's going on, and all the action and the writes happen in the Hackers alias?
It's both. Okay, so the CommitFest is more of just tracking the status of the patch. So for instance, when you get to the point where you actually do want to review a patch, you are going to have to get a Postgres.org account, and then you can sign up as a reviewer. You can log on and make yourself a reviewer. So everything is read-only to the public, so anyone can get in and see whatever they want. So you can just go in and explore without setting an account up. But you will need to set an account up to actually sign on as a reviewer. And if you're going to do reviews, you're definitely going to need to be able to post to the thread, which also means getting on PGSQL Hackers. We'll talk about that in a minute as well. But good question. But at this point, I'm imagining that you're not completely invested yet. You're just thinking, hey, it might be cool to go review a patch, right? So before you get too deeply involved, sign up for PGSQL Hackers, sign up for all this kind of stuff. Let's see if we can go find a patch, right, that you're actually interested in reviewing. So this next section is patch assessment. All right, so what I tried to do here, a lot of people can be pretty intimidated by just even finding a patch. So I tried to write down some steps that you should follow. These are purely advisory. I mean, I definitely want to say that I've been involved with the community, been using Postgres for a very long time, but I've really only been involved with this community for about 1.5 years. So I've been learning the ropes as well. It's one of the reasons why I wanted to do this talk, so kind of get these ideas, while these thoughts are fresh in my mind and I'm not a veteran reviewer, to kind of get some of them down, because this is the way I've been looking at things as I've been going through the review process. Different people have different opinions on this, there's no doubt. This is just meant to be a getting started kind of guideline. So, but the first thing you should do, if you see a patch that interests you, the first thing you should do is read the entire thread. It's extremely important to do. Not only will there be information about the patch, how it works, there'll also be, maybe counter arguments from other people that think maybe things should be different. I think the important thing is to realize is just because the patch in the CommitFest doesn't mean it's somehow approved. right? Anyone can put their patch in the commit fest. So the whole point of the commit fest is to make sure the patch is, a good piece of code, has documentation, has testing, is useful, doesn't duplicate functionality. That's the whole point. So you need to not go into this thinking that that every patch in there is just ready for you to review. Unfortunately, that's not actually true. And the way to find that out is to actually read the thread. So the things we're trying to figure out here, so you read through the thread, and then one of the very first things I look for is there a consensus on how the patch is supposed to work? So people might submit a patch, and then committers and other people will come in and say, well, no, I really don't think it should work that way. It should work like X. And then they will work with the patch author, and they'll kind of go back and forth, and they'll maybe work on different versions. If you're really looking at doing review, especially for kind of first-time review, it'd be best if you look for a patch where there's reasonable consensus. At that point on the thread, everyone has agreed that, yeah, this is the way we want to go with this. Doesn't mean the patch is completely finished yet or that it's completely bug-free, but at least the kind of idea behind the patch has been hammered out. If it hasn't been, then you maybe want to, jump in and give your own opinion. Right? I mean, we're always looking for input from the community and other developers on how they think things should work. So that's what here. So the details of the patch been finalized. I mean, is the whole idea of how it's going to work. And has a patch been provided that addresses all concerns? So there may have been a long conversation, and the author and other people have come to a consensus on what they're going to do, but there may not actually be a new patch yet. Right, the patch that was provided was an older patch before everyone had kind of agreed what was going to happen. They provided a new patch. So you really don't want to review, a patch that is obviously going to be reissued with changes and new functionality and things like that. So in that case, you might want to wait. However, if the answer to all these questions is yes, and you're still interested, and the patch is interesting. Yeah, sorry, I kind of lost my train there. But if the answer to all these questions is yes, then you can proceed to review the patch, and we'll talk about that in the next slides. Otherwise, you can try to determine what is holding the patch up. So, like I said originally, is the author waiting on a consensus? Are there technical issues? Is there anything you can do to help? Sometimes the thing you can do to help is just to give your opinion. To say, I think this is a good way to do things, or I think this other way is a good thing. In the community, we do a lot of kind of plus one, minus one kind of deal. Like people will just come in, and you don't have to write a book. You can literally just come in and say +1 to so-and-so's idea. And by doing that, you're just showing support for that idea and saying that to you, it makes sense. And we kind of go by that consensus. It's a little informal. But the idea is, if enough people say one way is the way to do it and no one else has a strong objection, then we tend to go in that direction. So just showing your support for an idea can be extremely useful. So before we go on to reviewing, let's talk about the threads. So like I said, all of the actual conversation about a patch is done on an email thread. The CommitFest app is just for keeping basically status on what's going on with it. So there's quite a bit of information. I'm just going to highlight some of the stuff down here. So the introduction to the mailing list is down here. It'll tell you how to sign up. It'll give you some information on basic etiquette and things like that. One thing I've also found very handy is that if you save the raw file, message file from the web, you can actually bring it into your email client and reply to it. So that means you don't have to have been on Hackers for forever. You don't have to keep all the email. You can always just go to the archive, save out the EML file, bring it into your favorite client. I've done it in Thunderbird. You can do it in Pine. You can do it in Apple Mail. You name it. You bring it in, and then you can reply to it just as if you had received that email in your own account. So when you are posting, remember to stay on topic, right? It's really easy to go on a tangent and kind of go off in another direction. It happens all the time. But if you can try not to, it really helps. If you have a tangent that you want to discuss, that's fine. Just open another thread. Right? It's perfectly legitimate to start a new conversation about this other thing that you realized while you were looking at this patch. But it's best for the patch thread if you can just stay on topic and focus on that patch. Be professional, always, of course. Be polite. Sometimes people are, things can get a little rough on the list sometimes, and people can be intimidated by that. So it's all of our job to keep the level of conversation on the list extremely polite and extremely professional. That way, everyone feels comfortable. No one's intimidated. It's intimidated enough to be dealing with some of these very experienced, very senior developers who know 10,000 more times about anything than we do without anything being discourteous. So always be very, very careful of that. And please, please, please do not top post. Does everyone know what I mean by top posting? Okay, all right. Sorry?
Can you just give an example?
Okay. So unfortunately, I don't have but a top post is when you reply to and your cursor pops up instantly at the top.
Rather than in context.
Rather than in line. So, and what you really want to do is edit the email as you go too. Like pull out sections that aren't relevant to your argument. Put nice spacing in between, the existing reply text and your stuff, and put your argument in line. And that way people who reply that can continue to go in line, and this conversation just grows over time and it makes sense. So if you top post, the first thing people will do is they'll politely answer your question, and then they'll say, please don't top post, because it makes a thread almost impossible. Like the thread just doesn't work if you top post. One thing you should remember is that your posts are visible to the public and archived indefinitely, right? So what you say not only reflects on you, it reflects on the community. It's all of us, really. It's not like we're not a closed source company that can keep all their little peccadillos hidden. I mean, anything we say and any argument we have is completely public record, and public record basically forever, right? So, we want to put the best face on things. We want to get along, and we want to, look good as a community. And I think, fostering that kind of environment also makes us more productive. It's a community that people want to be a part of, and that we're happy being a part of. All right, so this is a little bit of a non sequitur, but remember the slide a couple of slides ago where I said, if all the answers to these questions are yes, then proceed to review? Well, we've gotten to that part now. So this is the part where we're actually going to look at the various steps of review and the parts where you can help out. So the first thing to do, if you have decided to review, you'll need to get an account on postgres.org, and then you can register as a reviewer on the CommitFest app. But the other thing that's really good to do is actually, at that point, respond on the thread. Basically say that you're going to review the patch, and then especially to say which parts you're going to be looking at. So if it's just documentation, fine. If it's just functional testing, fine. Some people just do performance analysis. There are people who consistently, that's sort of their thing. They look at these patches that have performance implications, and they do performance analysis, and that's fine. So generally people will get on, comment, and say these are the parts they're doing. If you're doing everything, if you're planning to do a 100% review of the patch, it's not as important to respond. The entry in the CommitFest is enough. But if you're doing part of the patch, then it's good to come on and say something. And this just informs other potential reviewers of the areas you're covering, so they can maybe cover other areas. But it's okay if more than one person is covering an area, right? A lot of these patches are, even if it's not a big and complex patch, every patch is important, because everything that's added to Postgres is something that has to be maintained, it has to be tested, it has all this stuff for years. I mean, removing something from Postgres is almost impossible, a feature, right? It takes years to deprecate something out and get rid of it. So we take it very seriously, everything that goes in. So having multiple reviewers is fine. For a big patch, it'll be, you might have 5 reviewers. For a small patch, maybe it'll just be 1 or 2. The other thing to remember when you're doing reviews is that it's okay if you mess up, right? Or if you miss something, because the committer is always going to look at all aspects of the patch. And remember, the original goal was to save the committer time, but we do that by having the patches in good a shape as possible. So what we don't want the committer to have to do is say, hey, there's no docs, or hey, there's no tests, or hey, this thing doesn't compile, right? Because they've spent their time discovering one of those very basic things that anyone else could have discovered and dealt with in advance. So by the time it gets to the committer, you would hope that the documentation is done, the tests are done. Now, it's not every patch won't always have all the stuff to begin with. They'll think, oh, they didn't know where to put the tests, or they didn't realize that a test was required, or I actually have a patch right now where I've been asked to add more tests. So I'm going to add more tests because they're right. I missed. I wasn't thinking. I thought I didn't need to test that particular section, but I did. Actually, I thought it was already tested, but I was incorrect. So, that's the kind of thing that's expected. And so when we get the thing to the committer, we want it as complete as possible. So, right, so once you've declared your intentions, you can proceed with the review. So one of the basic things that you might want to think about reviewing is documentation. Documentation is written in SGML, and then we have a whole big build system with OpenJade and stuff to convert that into PDF, MAN, HTML, like all the different formats. So all the different types of documentation in Postgres are generated from a single source. So once you make changes there, it'll go everywhere. So I just gave a little example of a documentation patch. All this does is change the default value of a particular setting. This was done in 9.6. And there were some other patches of the documentation as well, but of course I could only fit this small snippet on the page. So documentation is a great area for non-coders to contribute, obviously. As obviously everyone in the room is a developer, we've already established that. You know how hard it is to write documentation for your own code, right? It's not any easier for anyone else. It's always easier for you to come in and document and test someone else's code. The things that they might think are obvious won't be obvious to you. So there's a lot of potential to contribute there. In addition, a lot of patch authors are not native English speakers. So they'll write documentation, but there may be some problems with it. So if you're a native English speaker, feel free, don't be afraid to go in and clean up grammatical mistakes or awkward phrasing or things like that. In my experience, the patch authors who are not native English speakers always appreciate that. Right, always be polite. Don't just say, hey, your English sucks. Just say, hey, I did a little rewording. What do you think? In my experience, that's always been appreciated. So, we have to understand that, the main docs are in English, but not everyone is a fluent speaker, even if they're a great coder. And you also want to look for not just, grammar mistakes and things like that, but you want to look for areas where a potential user could misunderstand the intent of the feature, right? Is the documentation clear? Does it describe the feature? Does it actually help the user? Which is less us, right? We're more developers, so we already have a different perspective, but we're trying to communicate with the user to what this feature is actually going to do. The next thing you can do, which is relatively simple, is you can apply and compile the patch. And here I've given a simple example. It really is as simple as this. You may want to pass more options to configure, based on your environment and stuff like that. But basically, you clone Postgres, you run configure, you apply the patch. This patch, for example, is my last patch for the base backup stuff I'm working on. And then you do make install. And that'll build Postgres with the patch included and actually install it locally. This is a good thing to do in, say, a virtual machine or a Docker container or something like that. If you're not using virtualization for development in some way, I strongly recommend it. That way you don't have to worry about stomping all over your own system. But you can also give parameters to configure to install in a certain subdirectory. So you can have like 5 versions of Postgres installed and running on different ports and all that kind of stuff, without doing virtualization. So really up to you, but I do prefer to do it that way. So let's say the patch doesn't apply or compile. First of all, if it doesn't apply, that's actually really common. You wouldn't think so, but especially in a busy commit fest, over time, the patches will just get out of date. 2 patches that affect the same area of code, one gets committed. They were both based on master originally, so now the second patch that was the second one to be committed to be looked at, doesn't actually apply cleanly anymore. So if it doesn't apply cleanly, then you can try to determine the cause of the issue. So what I like to do is, obviously you can do this kind of binary search thing, right, where you go through. What I like to do first is find a commit that's as close to the date of the email, that the patch was attached to as possible, right? Under the assumption, I may not get the exact commit the author worked with, but I'll be pretty close, and probably I can get it to apply. At that point, I usually feel like that's enough, and I'll say, hey, it applies here, but it doesn't apply on current head, right? And it's really up to the patch author to go and find the exact commit that caused the problem. If you're feeling especially bold, you can go ahead and do that work too. And sometimes if I'm working with a bunch of different patches and reviewing, and especially in last March, I was the commit fest manager, so I was fluent in a lot of patches, and a lot of times I would know which patch had broken it. And I could just respond, because I was doing a lot of compiling just to make sure things were working, keeping the commit fest going along, and a lot of times I could immediately identify the patch that had caused the problem. But in general, I was a little too busy to go and find the exact commit, but it's enough to say, hey, this thing needs to be rebased. It doesn't apply any longer. Or sometimes things will apply, but not compile. The diffing tool is not perfect. It will sometimes apply things that then, essentially cause garbage. Some variables disappeared that it's using in another file, and the diff tool doesn't know that, so now it applies, but it doesn't compile anymore. Occasionally, one thing I like to do is when I'm putting a patch out there, I always try to give the commit that I know it compiles under. That way, if people do have a problem with applying it or do have a problem with it compiling, at least they can go back to that point if they want to, still want to play with it and review it. But let's say, if it doesn't apply or it doesn't compile, that's pretty much the end of your responsibility. You reply on the thread and you say, hey, it didn't apply on head. That's really all you have to do. That's a lot of information. Or you could do a little more analysis. But if it does apply and compile, then the next thing to do would be to start looking at the functionality. So functional testing requires a working knowledge of Postgres, but not necessarily any coding experience. We're just going to get into PSQL or PGM and whatever tool you want to use and try the feature and see if it actually works as advertised. So you want to test the patch, make sure it does what's in the SGML documentation, right? So make sure those two things are consistent with each other. Or in the email thread. Like I said, not all features are outward facing. And sometimes, there will be documentation in the code, but there'll also be information in the email thread of the sort of design philosophy behind it. Not every little feature gets its own README file in the source tree. Really only more complicated subsystems get that. And then, so if you find that it doesn't work the way it's supposed to work, now you've got two options. You can, if you are comfortable going down and looking at the code, you can go do that and suggest a fix. You can even create a patch based on the author's original patch to say, hey, I created this patch with a fix. And you can send that back to them. Or a lot of times I'll just copy a snippet of code and say, it looks like there's a problem here, and you should do this instead, and allow the author to issue the new patch. Like I said, it'd be kind of confusing if other people are putting patches on the same thread, because the commit-fest app will pull the last patch. So if that's mine instead of the patch authors, it can be a little confusing. So I try not to do that, but other people do. The other thing you can do is just simply report the issue. I've looked at some patches that were complicated enough that I wasn't really qualified to figure out, crazy authentication stuff or other things. I'm like, well, I'm not exactly sure what's causing the problem, but what I can tell you is it doesn't work, and here's the failure scenario. And they may ask for various debug output. Basically, you want to give as much information you can when you're reporting an error, but reporting an error is enough. That gives the patch author a lot of information on that something's wrong and that they need to look at something. Another thing you can do before you get to actual coding is performance testing. I'm not going to talk a lot about performance testing, but basically, if there's a new feature, it should have acceptable performance. Obviously, this is somewhat subjective. Like, what is acceptable performance? And debates on this kind of rage back and forth. Some people will say, well, there's an example of a new feature that's in 9.6, which is the snapshot too old, sort of a la Oracle style kind of stuff. And when it's turned on, it has some real performance implications on your system. Like, things don't work as quickly. So a lot of people's argument, well, the functionality is so important that we can live with a performance hit. Because it's going to solve this problem of bloat in our database and all this other things. And other people were saying, well, no, that's unacceptable performance hit, and no one would ever use it if it's going to perform like that. And what followed was a bunch of optimization and some other things. And certainly to make sure that there was no performance, well, this is the second point. the biggest thing was there's a little performance regression even when the feature was turned off. And this was the thing that people definitely found unacceptable. They're like, no, it has to perform just the way it did before when the feature is turned off. We can't have a regression there if people don't want to use this feature and they're still going to take a performance hit. So that's almost the more important thing. Like a new feature, the performance of it is, like I said, what's good and what's bad is really subjective. But an existing feature, not really subjective anymore. If let's say I've got a system built on 9.5 and I'm using some particular type of join or some particular type of feature, I know that when I upgrade to 9.6, I'm going to have to retest things, but I expect there not to be major regressions in features that I'm already using. If there's a new feature and the performance is not acceptable for me, then I'm going to find that out when I try to use it, but I haven't already baked into my system. So while new feature testing can be really tough to figure out what the performance should be, current feature testing, if you're testing between, say, what's on master and what's in 9.6, you should see consistency between those two things. If there's any major time regression in the new feature, then that would be something to report. Just to say, performance testing is often done by developers with access to like unique or large-scale systems, not the run-of-the-mill. So, if you have a MacBook Pro, you can certainly do performance testing and do comparisons and things like that. But there are a lot of people with MacBook Pros, so it may not be the best way to be contributing. But if you have, say, a 80-core machine that you have access to that you can run this new feature on and see if it actually scales up the way the author claims, then that becomes extremely valuable because you've got a unique piece of hardware that generally most people don't have. All right, and finally we get to the last thing. So this is so all of these things have been have been patch review, but now we're going to get to the actual code review. So I like to say this is really the last step, right? I want to make sure the documentation is in place, tests are in place, that the patch actually does what it says it does, that the performance is acceptable if there are performance implications, like this whole list. And I tend to do that before I spend a lot of time looking at the code. I might look at the code if there's an actual problem with the patch, and I'll look at the code to try to figure out why. But as you go through those initial steps of review, the patch itself, the source code underneath it, can actually change quite a bit. So I find it's a lot more efficient to kind of save the final code review for last. Although I may go through earlier and say, hey, you really need more comments. This file has 0 comments, and I'm not following it. But this is definitely a step that should be taken, is generally undertaken by people who have more experience in the language and are conversant with the project coding standards. The project coding standards are a bit of an ephemeral thing. Some of them are written down, but a lot of them are sort of, you look at the code base enough and you're trying to make your code look like the rest of the code base, right? This is pretty much like every project on the planet kind of works that way. There are quite a few things that are codified. I think I have the URL for it later, but not everything. So you just have to look at existing pieces of code and make your stuff match. But over time, as you get more experience, it'll be more obvious how to do that. However, obviously, it doesn't mean that more inexperienced coders can't jump in. There's a lot of things you can look at. You can look at function size. You can say, hey, there's this like 3,000 line function in the middle of this file that doesn't make any sense, or there aren't enough comments for me to follow this code, or that kind of thing. So it's not you don't necessarily have to have a complete deep understanding of the code in order to make a contribution to patch review. And then, of course, the best way to learn is by doing, right? It can be a little intimidating jumping into some of these patches because, especially if it's a big one and it's an area that you haven't really looked at yet, there are a lot of different areas of Postgres, and there's a lot of interesting code in there. And I know some portion of it. There's some areas. You guys may know I'm the author of PG Backrest, so if it's something to do with backup or recovery or something like that, I know all that stuff really well now. I know it almost line by line. But if it's something, say, the executor, yeah, I can follow the code, but I don't know that section that well. But the only way that you get to know these sections is by going in, maybe jumping in and trying to review a patch that's a little uncomfortable for you, maybe a little bit beyond your experience, but and then you'll learn something, and it's a feedback loop because you'll say things or you'll make reviews, and other people will say, well, no, really, that's not exactly the way that works, or well, you're close, but actually it's like this. So that's really, over time, that kind of feedback loop with the community is the thing that's going to give you that experience. There's only so much experience you can get just by reading the code and not jumping in and participating. Apparently that's about all I got, so. So I'm at 10. So, well, first of all, let me just ask if there are any questions. Go.
Do you need to tag yourself as a reviewer before you make any comments on the thread?
No, you do not. No, you do not. You can definitely, you can jump in and make comments on a thread anytime you want, on any thread. I mean, not just threads that are related to patches, but anything on PGSQL hackers, general, that kind of thing. So, yeah, the short answer is no. And in fact, I don't think there's anything wrong with doing some exploratory work on the patch before you actually commit. Because once you put your name down to review something, you really should review it. Sometimes people get overburdened and they take themselves off of review. Usually when people do that, they try to get someone else to come fill in for them rather than just bailing. But everyone understands, everyone has a job, right? Everyone's working. Not everyone can spend 100% of their time working on Postgres. So it's understood. If you do it a lot, people are going to start to think that maybe you're not a very reliable reviewer. So it's a good point. One thing you can do is just kind of jump into the thread, after you've read it and you kind of understand, and maybe ask some questions or say, this isn't clear to me, or like I said, give a vote on how you'd like the patch to go. I mean, I've certainly looked at patches where the patch went away that I just didn't, like I tried to nudge it in a way that I thought made more sense, and it didn't go that way. And so I ended up not reviewing it. I, like everyone else, I have a limited amount of time. There are only a certain number of patches I can look at, so I'm going to kind of pick my babies, the ones that I really want to see committed. Or obviously, I work for a company that does Postgres development, so we also have patches we're interested in shepherding through. So, but I have a limited amount of time, and no one is obligated to review any patch. It's a completely voluntary activity, so you should be reviewing the things that you find interesting, that are together, where you're communicating well with the author. And yeah, there's nothing wrong with picking and choosing. In fact, if I was doing anything in this presentation, it was trying to drive home the point that it's perfectly okay to be choosy, and that's kind of what's expected. It's not an egalitarian thing where you sign on and you're just assigned a random patch to go review. And that's not really the way we'd want it to be either. Anyone else? Okay, well, that's all I got, so thank you very much.